A friend of mine asked me fairly recently, when I start working on one of these Pico 8 projects, what is it that I start from? Like, is it the graphics? Clearly, if you've seen my videos before, you know it's not the graphics. Is it the music? Is it some sort of narrative? But yeah, I mean, perhaps not surprisingly, if you've seen any of these projects, it's a mechanical thing. I'm thinking about what I want to make the player do and like how I want it to feel, and hopefully why that is going to turn out to be fun. That was mostly what the last video was about. And as I work on this Excitebike, I have been talking a lot about sort of what I pulled from the original Excitebike and how I've been trying to link the various mechanics that I added to the game together to make them more fun. If you're interested in that, you can check that video out. It's not bad, if I do say so myself. This video is about something else though. This video is about feedback. Allow me to present to you my thesis. It's easy to tell a player when they've done something wrong. It's much more difficult to tell them when they've done something right. And we'll relabel those two things as negative feedback and positive feedback. My guess is that this split is for a number of reasons. In a lot of games, you win, in air quotes, a lot more or more frequently than you lose. Now you may beg to differ. There might be like a really difficult game where you're like, nah dog, like I die a lot more in Celeste than I win. But you only think you do. See, think of a basic platformer, right? We'll wind it all the way back. Let's think of something like Super Mario Brothers. The win condition in Super Mario Brothers is just, okay, get all of the way to the right side of the level. What that means is every step forward, every pit that you're jumping over is like a tiny victory, right? Or at least you're getting closer to the big victory. So if the player is always making progress, they're always doing the right thing, they're always getting closer to victory, how do we like let them know that that's the right thing? Like, how do we give positive feedback for, moving from left to right? Do you want to like play a fanfare and spray confetti all over the place every time dude just takes a step? Probably not, right? That would be a little bit overwhelming. So we don't really know what to do about positive feedback, but let's think a little bit about the negative feedback. You get hit and you lose your power up. The whole game just stops for a second, just to tell you that you screwed up. The same thing if you die. Not only does the music stop and the game stops, but you get a little squelched Mario sprite and it smash cuts to black. And you've got to go all the way back to whatever freaking checkpoint the game designers decided they were going to put in like 1984. It's brutal. It is also effective. Like, when you screw up in Mario, every single mistake you make very, very clearly. Your errors and the associated penalties are much more readily communicated to you than those tiny victories that we mentioned before. But I think we can dig a little bit deeper here. There are enemies in Super Mario Brothers, and you can stomp them, and that is a kind of victory. When you do that, you get a nice little sound effect. You get a smooshed little Goomba sprite. You get a little point pop up. So now we're getting somewhere. If we look at Super Mario Brothers 2, there are no point pop-ups, but you do get a nice sound effect. And it just sort of feels good, mechanically, to smush two bad guys into one another. So there's that combination of like the sonic reward, the sound reward, and the mechanical reward, if you want to call it that. That feels good. So that's sort of one way of communicating, like, yeah, keep doing that. Keep smushing guys. Let's take a look at Sonic the Hedgehog, or actually Sonic the Hedgehog 2, because that's what I have footage for. As a Nintendo kid growing up, it does sort of pain me to admit this, but I do think that there was an evolution here from Super Mario Brothers in terms of how positive feedback is being delivered. And I think it's probably one of the many reasons why Sonic resonated so well with players when it was released. Sonic is at its core the same kind of game as Mario. It's a platformer. You go from left to right. The goal is to get all the way to the right side of the level. But with Sonic, they kind of figured out how to reward those tiny victories of progressively moving forward. It's the speed. I think I used that exact same line in the previous video, but it's the speed. The moment-to-moment reward is just that you go fast. And the faster you go, the more you are progressing to the right and the more good you feel. So it all ties together, right? The game is like rewarding you for doing the thing that you're supposed to do. There are no like boring parts in between where you're just kind of walking. Okay, well, like maybe there are like some of those parts, like just like a couple. It's not a perfect game, okay? But it's a great game. Even in Sonic's case though, the negative feedback is a real kick in the teeth, because not only do you lose all of your rings, but you also had that sensation of speed that you were enjoying so much, that you were thrilled by. That just gets ripped right out from under you when you get hit. So while they did find a way to reward the player's moment-to-moment progress with this kind of positive feedback, it did also make it even easier to make the player feel the negative feedback, even more acutely than they otherwise would have. So again, in this case, I would propose that the experience of positive feedback is somehow more nuanced and difficult to impart than that of negative feedback. Anyway, Mario, Sonic, right. These are very old games, but we can take some of the ideas that they had for how to give positive feedback and see what maybe we can use in our game. We saw a sensation of speed as one reward, along with cool sound effects and different sprites and other little visual pops. As luck would have it, in this little Excitebike-like snowboarding game that I'm working on, the goal is also to make it to the right side of the level. It's not a platformer, not really, I guess, and I don't have any sound or music added yet, so we're gonna throw out all the sound rewards. But we can demonstrate how adding some simple bells and whistles can serve as positive feedback and encourage the player to keep moving to the right as fast as they can. I knew I'd be doing this video for a while now, so I prepared like a good YouTuber, and while I added a bunch of things to the game, I also included this little debug table that will allow me to just disable all of those neat things that I added to show you, I want to say the vanilla version of the game, but it's not even vanilla. Vanilla is a flavor. We shouldn't besmirch vanilla by using it in such a demeaning way. We should find some other plain, uninteresting thing to talk about, like baking soda. This is the baking soda flavored version of the game that I'm about to show you, that has no juice, no bells and whistles, no positive feedback at all. It's just the regular game with nothing. And it doesn't feel that good. And that's what caused me to want to think about, how do we give positive feedback? You can see in the debug table here that there are 4 different elements that I can enable and disable, and they've got these sort of cryptic names like pose and pin flash, and I'm going to explain all that as we go, but let's just have a look at the old baking soda version first. So much like Excitebike, the point of this game, the goal, is to go from left to right within a certain amount of time. It's a real thematic consistency to these old action games, I guess. The difficulty that you might encounter is that whenever you go over a jump, much like an Excitebike, you're supposed to angle yourself, in this case your snowboard, to the angle of the ground that you're landing on. And if you do that successfully, you won't lose any speed, but if you fail to do that, you will lose speed. Pretty early on, it was obvious to me how I could give negative feedback to the player when they screw up, which was when they land incorrectly, we do a little bit of screen shake and we throw a bunch of snow particles in the air to be like, you didn't do that one good. But as you can see in this version, even if the player lands correctly, like if they manage to angle the board in the right way, we're not giving them any feedback that they've done the right thing. You know, there's no point pop up. There's no sound at all right now, but there's no success sound. There's nothing. They just don't receive the negative feedback, right? The positive feedback is the absence of negative feedback. And that didn't feel like enough. So after some trial and error, what I kind of landed on was, what if we change the player sprite? Any kind of celebration or just visual change to show that the player did the thing that we expect them to do. So let's set the first flag in our debug table, which is called pose, to true. And what this is going to do is whenever the player successfully lands a jump and sets the board angle correctly, the player sprite will change slightly. So if the player lands on a flat surface, they do a satisfying little crouch. They absorb the blow of landing on the snow. If they land on an angled surface, they'll throw their arm up in celebration. I may actually add the celebration arm to the flat pose too. I just haven't done that yet. But what we're trying to do here is just give some visual indication that the player did the thing correctly. So this is subtle, but I think it works, and it's definitely an improvement on the baking soda version. The next piece of information that I wanted to give to the player relates to the speed pinning mechanic that I talked about in the last video. Again, check it out if you got some time. To summarize, the way speed pinning works is whenever you're in the air, you're losing a little bit of speed. And if you land the jump correctly, you won't lose any additional speed, but you won't gain any either. But if you wait to the last possible second to adjust the angle of your board before you hit the ground, it automatically puts your speed back up to the maximum value. That's called speed pinning. How do we tell the player that not only did they land the jump correctly with the little sprite change, but also they executed the speed pin mechanic correctly and correctly angled their board at the right timing? Let's enable the next flag in our debug table, which I've named Pin Flash. And what this will do is whenever the player successfully executes a speed pin move, it'll flash the outline of the player sprite for just a quick second. So now you get a combination of the player's pose changing if you did the angle correctly, and the player will flash a little bit if you did the speed pin correctly. Now I feel like we're really getting somewhere. This is a little bit more, for me, visually interesting than what we started with. The game also has a boosting mechanic where if you press a button, you can temporarily increase your max velocity beyond what it normally is. It's a button that makes you go real fast. And the previous speed pinning mechanic also applies to this. Even while you're boosting, being in the air causes you to lose a bit of speed. But if you angle your board correctly, and you time it correctly, and you're boosting, you'll get the speed pin back up to the maximum boost speed. Not only that, but you actually can extend the time that your boost is active if you do it correctly. So there's sort of a double benefit to executing the mechanic while you're boosting. So I think we need to make this positive feedback even more flashy because there's a lot more benefit to doing it. So we kind of need the player to feel like, yeah, I'm doing it like really right during this part. So not only are we changing the sprite and also flashing the player, but I want to add some particles. So I'm going to go ahead and enable the next flag in our debug table, which I've named pin particles, which hopefully will make some sense now. So it's quite subtle, so you may not have noticed this, but as the player is just kind of boarding normally, there's a little bit of snow being thrown up around the board, like little white particles. It's hard to see because most of the background is white. You only see the particles when they're against the player or against certain elements of the course. But I thought it would be cool if the particles were also flashing for this mechanic, so we added some like super colorful particles. So now, if you're boosting and you land correctly and you timed it correctly, in order to indicate that like you're getting an extra speed boost and some extra time to your boost, we've got a bunch of like cool flashing yellow, blue, orange particles that get tossed up into the air. So now this thing is looking super flashy. But there's one more thing we can do. I don't know if you noticed, but when we boost, when I press the button to like do the boost, the player just kind of goes. Like there's no, exciting like charge up or anything like that. Like the player is moving one speed and now he's moving another speed, and I don't know, it's not very exciting. So I wanted to add something like cool and satisfying whenever the player presses the boost button. So let's enable the final flag in our debug table. Now I've named this flag Sakurai, and that's because you are probably aware of Masahiro Sakurai, the man behind the Smash Brothers games. He also has a YouTube channel where he talks a lot about game design. One of his early videos, he talks about this sort of like stopping the action in order to make the player more excited about what they're doing. So I decided that this boost mechanic was a good target for what I have deemed a Sakurai stop, which is stop the action for a second to let the player know that they're doing something cool. So I've enabled the Sakurai flag in my debug table, and now whenever I boost, the action stops for a minute, the background flips to sort of a monochromatic thing, and a bunch of colorful flashing lines move towards the player's head or the player's crotch, depending on which lane they're currently positioned in. That is a bug. I will fix that positioning later. But yeah, anyway, you see a bunch of cool like lines moving towards the player, and then the boost kicks in. So now I sort of feel like the boost is a little bit more satisfying to pull off. It's not just that you start going faster, it's that you see this very short, so hopefully not terribly intrusive, but also kind of exciting charge up thing. So now if we side by side compare the baking soda version with the version with all of the flags enabled, I think the game is just a lot more interesting to look at, but also the player is like a lot more aware of what's happening on screen now, right? They've got more information. They've got sprite changes, they've got flashing, they've got particles, they've got the very obvious Sakurai stop thrown in there. So to me, like, this, in a way, is not only giving feedback to the player, but sort of giving them more control, right? The things that they're doing are impacting what's happening on screen. And I think that is what makes this a more interesting version of the game. So what does success look like? How do we tell the player that they're doing the right thing? How do we do positive feedback? I think if we look closely at some of the titles of the past, we can start to get some ideas. And not just games of the past, but I mean, YouTube channels of the present. Thank you, Mr. Sakurai, for doing what you did there. And we don't have to be shy about, pilfering those ideas and putting them into our own titles to make our games a little bit more interesting. I guess the contrast here is that, like we said at the top of the video, while positive feedback is a lot more subtle and a lot more difficult to plan out than negative feedback is, because the player is always winning, is always getting those little victories, at least in a lot of genres, if you're implementing positive feedback, it also makes the game more consistently visually interesting and consistently visually exciting, because you're having to do it a lot more frequently and add those elements a lot more often. And you're giving the player more of an ability to influence what's going on screen, which, I mean, if you're going to abstract what games are all about, I guess that's one route you could go down. As for my current attempt at a game, the last video I tagged version 0.3. I haven't tagged this version yet because there are a couple more things that I want to do, but then I'll tag 0.4. I'll talk about that more in the next video. I appreciate you, I appreciate the time you spent on this video, and I hope that whatever it is you're building right now, it's rad as heck. Until next time, I have been Eric, this has been Radical Slice.